The sun was beating down hard on the Arizona desert in the summer of 1883. Elizabeth wiped the sweat from her face as she looked out at her small ranch. Everything around her was dry and dusty. The nearest town was 30 miles away, and she hadn't seen another person in weeks. Her little house was made of adobe bricks with thick walls that helped keep the heat out during the day. Behind the house, she had a small garden where she grew beans, corn, and squash. A few chickens pecked around in the dirt, and her 3 cows stood in whatever shade they could find. Elizabeth had been living alone for 8 months now. Her husband Thomas had died of fever the winter before, leaving her to take care of everything by herself. She was only 26 years old, but she felt much older. The loneliness was the hardest part. Some nights she would sit on her porch and listen to the coyotes howling in the distance, feeling like she was the only person left in the world. Most of her neighbors had packed up and left after the Apache troubles started getting worse. The Johnson family, who lived 10 miles east, had abandoned their farm after finding their cattle killed. The Williams family to the south had loaded their wagon one morning and headed back to Texas without even saying goodbye. But Elizabeth stayed. This ranch was all she had left of her life with Thomas. They had worked so hard to build it together. Every fence post, every room in the house, every furrow in the garden had been made with their own hands. She couldn't just walk away from all that work and all those memories. Besides, she told herself, she had always gotten along with the Apache people. Not that she knew many of them personally, but she had learned some basic words in their language from an old trader named Pete who came by every few months. Pete had lived in Arizona for 30 years and spoke Apache fluently. He told her that most Apache people were just trying to survive, same as everyone else. Elizabeth believed in treating all people fairly, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. Her mother had taught her that when she was little back in Missouri. Judge people by their actions, not their appearance, her mother used to say. There's good and bad in every group of people. The Apache Wars had been going on for years now. The government was trying to force all the Apache bands onto reservations, but many of them refused to go. They wanted to keep living the way their ancestors had lived, moving freely across the land and hunting where they pleased. Elizabeth could understand that. She wouldn't want to be forced to live somewhere she didn't choose either. Still, the constant tension made life difficult for everyone. The cavalry patrols rode through the area regularly, always looking for signs of Apache camps. Sometimes Elizabeth would see smoke signals in the distance between the mountains. She never knew if they meant danger or if they were just Apache families communicating with each other about everyday things, like where to find water or good hunting. Her daily routine had become simple but exhausting. She woke up before dawn to milk the cows and feed the chickens. Then she would tend to her garden, pulling weeds and checking for insects that might damage her crops. The vegetables were crucial for her survival. Without them, she would have to make the dangerous 30-mile trip to town more often to buy food. In the afternoons, when the heat became unbearable, she would retreat inside her house and work on mending clothes or preparing meals. She had learned to preserve meat by drying it in the sun, the way Pete had shown her. She also made soap from animal fat and lye and candles from tallow. The evenings were when the loneliness hit hardest. After finishing her chores, she would sit on her porch and watch the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. The silence was both beautiful and frightening. Sometimes she would talk to her chickens just to hear a human voice, even if it was her own. Elizabeth had a rifle that Thomas had taught her to use, but she hoped she would never need it. She kept it loaded and ready just in case. Pete had warned her that desperate people, whether Apache or white, might try to take advantage of a woman living alone. But so far, her biggest problems had been rattlesnakes and the occasional mountain lion. She had developed a system for staying safe. Every evening, she would walk around her property to check for signs that anyone had been there. She looked for footprints, disturbed plants, or anything out of place. She also kept her animals close to the house at night, bringing the chickens into a coop and keeping the cows in a small corral near the back door. The isolation was taking its toll on her mind as well as her body. Sometimes she would find herself talking to Thomas as if he were still there. She would tell him about her day or ask his advice about problems with the ranch. It felt good to imagine he was listening, even though she knew it wasn't real. Elizabeth had been raised in a religious family, and she still prayed every night. She asked God to keep her safe and to help her find the strength to keep going. She also prayed for peace between all the different groups of people in the territory. She believed that if people could just talk to each other and try to understand each other's point of view, most conflicts could be solved without violence. Her supplies were running low, and she knew she would have to make a trip to town soon. The thought frightened her. The journey was dangerous enough for a man with a good horse and a rifle. For a woman traveling alone with a wagon, it was terrifying. But she needed flour, sugar, coffee, and ammunition. She also hoped to get news about what was happening in other parts of the territory. Pete hadn't been by in almost 3 months, which was unusual for him. She worried that something might have happened to him. He was getting old, and the desert was unforgiving to anyone who made a mistake. As Elizabeth settled in for another night alone, she had no idea that her quiet, solitary life was about to change forever. Tomorrow would bring an encounter that would test everything she believed about courage, compassion, and what it meant to be human. She checked the locks on her doors one more time, said her prayers, and tried to sleep. Outside, the coyotes began their nightly chorus, and the wind whispered through the desert plants. In the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, a small figure moved slowly through the darkness, drawn by the faint light of her oil lamp. The boy was lost, hungry, and more frightened than he had ever been in his 8 years of life. He had been separated from his family 3 days ago when the cavalry attacked their camp. Now he was alone in the vast desert, following the only sign of human life he had seen since then. The next morning started like any other for Elizabeth. She woke up before sunrise, stretched her sore muscles, and walked outside to begin her daily chores. The desert air was still cool, but she knew that within a few hours the temperature would climb to over 100 degrees. She milked the cows first, then scattered corn for the chickens. As she worked, she hummed a song her mother used to sing to her. It helped chase away the silence and made her feel less alone. The familiar routine was comforting, even though it reminded her of how much her life had changed since Thomas died. After breakfast, Elizabeth decided to work in her vegetable garden. The plants needed water, and some of the bean vines required staking to keep them from falling over. She put on her wide-brimmed hat and carried a bucket of water from the well. The garden was her pride and joy. Despite the harsh desert conditions, she had managed to grow enough vegetables to keep herself fed. The secret was watering early in the morning and late in the evening, when the sun wasn't so intense. She had also learned to plant certain crops together because they helped each other grow better. As she knelt among the bean plants, Elizabeth noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. At first she thought it might be a rabbit or a roadrunner, but when she looked more carefully, her heart nearly stopped. There was a small human figure crouched behind a cluster of mesquite trees about 50 yards from her garden. Elizabeth's first instinct was fear. Living alone had made her nervous about any unexpected visitors. But as she looked more closely, she realized it was just a child, a very young child, and from his appearance he was Apache. The boy was tiny, probably no more than 8 years old. His dark hair was tangled and dusty, and his clothes were torn and dirty. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see that he was painfully thin. His ribs showed through his ripped shirt, and his eyes had the hollow, desperate look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the desert. Elizabeth's mind raced. What was an Apache child doing here alone? Where was his family? Was this some kind of trap? She had heard stories of Apache warriors using women and children as decoys to lure settlers into ambushes. But as she watched the boy, her fears began to fade. He looked genuinely frightened and exhausted. He wasn't trying to hide or signal to anyone else. He was just sitting there, watching her with the sad, hopeful expression of a lost puppy. Elizabeth slowly stood up, being careful not to make any sudden movements that might scare him away. She remembered some of the Apache words that Pete had taught her. She wasn't sure if she would pronounce them correctly, but she had to try something. "Hello," she called out softly in Apache, using the word Pete had taught her. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. He probably hadn't expected a white woman to speak his language, even if it was just one word. Elizabeth took a few slow steps toward him, keeping her hands visible and open to show she wasn't carrying any weapons. "Are you hungry?" she asked, mixing Apache words with gestures toward her mouth and stomach. The boy nodded eagerly. Elizabeth could see now that he was even worse off than she had first thought. His lips were cracked from thirst, and his arms and legs were covered with scratches from desert thorns. He had obviously been traveling through rough country for several days. "Come," Elizabeth said, using another Apache word Pete had taught her. She pointed toward her house. Water, food, the boy hesitated. He was clearly torn between his desperate need for help and his natural fear of white people. Elizabeth understood his dilemma. From his perspective, she might be just as dangerous to him as he might be to her. Elizabeth tried a different approach. She slowly sat down on the ground, making herself appear smaller and less threatening. Then she took her water bottle from her belt and held it up so he could see it. She pretended to drink from it, then pointed to him. That did it. The boy's thirst overcame his fear. He stood up slowly and began walking toward her. Elizabeth noticed that he was limping slightly, probably from walking barefoot across the rocky desert for so long. When he reached her, Elizabeth handed him the water bottle. He grabbed it with both hands and drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. She had to gently take the bottle away from him to keep him from drinking too much too fast, which could make him sick. Slow, she said, using gestures to show him what she meant. Little bit, then more. The boy nodded and tried to control himself, taking smaller sips. Elizabeth could see the relief in his eyes as the cool water soothed his parched throat. She stood up carefully and began walking toward her house, moving slowly so the boy could keep up with his injured foot. She kept looking back to make sure he was following her, and to watch for any signs that he might collapse from exhaustion. When they reached her porch, Elizabeth pointed to the shaded area under the roof overhang. Sit, she said, using both English and Apache words. The boy gratefully sank down onto the wooden planks, leaning back against the adobe wall of the house. Elizabeth went inside to get food. Her mind was spinning with questions and concerns. Who was this child? How had he ended up alone in the desert? Were his parents looking for him? And most importantly, what was she going to do with him? She knew that helping an Apache child could be seen as treason by some white people in the territory. The government was at war with the Apache tribes, and anyone who aided them could be arrested or worse. But she also knew that she couldn't just turn away a hungry, thirsty child, regardless of his race. Elizabeth quickly gathered some food that would be easy for a starving child to digest. She got some bread, beans that she had cooked the day before, and a jar of preserved peaches. She also filled a pitcher with fresh water from her well. When she returned to the porch, the boy was still sitting where she had left him, but his eyes were closed. For a moment she thought he might have passed out from exhaustion, but when she set the food down beside him, his eyes snapped open. Elizabeth showed him the bread first, breaking off a small piece and eating it herself to show that it was safe. The boy took the bread with trembling hands and ate it so fast that Elizabeth worried he might choke. She had to keep encouraging him to eat slowly. His body was so desperate for food that he wanted to devour everything at once. Elizabeth remembered how Pete had told her that starving people could actually die from eating too much too quickly, after going without food for several days. As the boy ate, Elizabeth tried to communicate with him using the limited Apache vocabulary she knew. She learned that his name was something that sounded like Little Fox when translated into English. She told him her name was Elizabeth, though she wasn't sure if he understood. Through a combination of words and gestures, she began to piece together his story. He had been separated from his family 3 days ago during some kind of attack by soldiers. He had been hiding and traveling ever since, trying to find his way back to his people. Elizabeth's heart went out to him. She tried to imagine how terrified and alone he must have felt, wandering through the desert without food or water, not knowing if his family was alive or dead. As the afternoon wore on, Little Fox began to relax. The food and water had restored some of his strength, and Elizabeth's gentle manner had convinced him that she meant no harm. He even managed a small smile when she showed him her chickens. But as the sun began to set, Elizabeth faced a difficult decision. Night was coming, and the desert could be deadly after dark. She could send the boy away and hope he would find his family, but she knew he probably wouldn't survive another night alone. Or she could let him stay, knowing that this simple act of kindness might change both their lives forever. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Elizabeth found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life. Little Fox sat on her porch, looking much better after eating and drinking, but still obviously exhausted. The desert night would be cold and dangerous, especially for a child traveling alone. Elizabeth knew the risks of what she was considering. If anyone discovered that she was harboring an Apache child, she could be accused of treason. The territorial government had made it clear that anyone who aided Apache people in any way was considered an enemy. Some settlers had been arrested just for trading with Apache families. But looking at Little Fox, Elizabeth couldn't see an enemy. She saw a frightened, lost child who needed help. The same maternal instincts that had made her want children with Thomas now told her that she couldn't send this boy back into the wilderness to die. She tried to communicate with him about his family. Using gestures and the few Apache words she knew, she asked where his people were. Little Fox pointed toward the mountains to the north and spoke rapidly in his own language. Elizabeth couldn't understand most of what he said, but she caught a few words that Pete had taught her: soldiers, horses, and running. It seemed clear that his family had been attacked by cavalry and forced to flee. In the confusion, Little Fox had become separated from them. He had been wandering for 3 days trying to find them, or at least find his way to safety. Elizabeth's heart ached for him. She tried to imagine what his mother must be going through, not knowing if her child was alive or dead. As a woman who had wanted children of her own, she could barely stand to think about such pain. As darkness fell, Elizabeth made her choice. She couldn't send Little Fox away into the night. Whatever the consequences might be, she had to follow her conscience. "You stay here tonight," she told him in her broken Apache, supplemented with gestures.
Safe, warm. Little Fox looked surprised and a little frightened.
Elizabeth realized he might be worried that she was planning to turn him over to the authorities in the morning. She tried to reassure him with a gentle smile and by bringing him a blanket from inside the house. Elizabeth had a small spare room that she and Thomas had planned to use as a nursery someday. The room had remained empty since his death, serving as a painful reminder of the children they would never have together. Now, for the first time, it would serve its intended purpose. She led Little Fox inside and showed him the room. It had a simple bed with a straw mattress, a wooden chair, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. Elizabeth had put fresh sheets on the bed and laid out some of Thomas's smaller clothes that might fit the boy. Little Fox stared at the bed in amazement. Elizabeth realized he had probably never slept on a real mattress before. Apache families typically slept on buffalo hides or woven mats on the ground. The soft bed with clean white sheets must have seemed like incredible luxury to him. Elizabeth showed him how to use the wash basin and pitcher of water she had brought for him to clean up. She left him alone to wash and change clothes, giving him privacy and time to get used to his new surroundings. While Little Fox cleaned up, Elizabeth sat in her kitchen and tried to think through what she had gotten herself into. She was now hiding an Apache child in her house during a time of war. If cavalry patrols came by, what would she do? Could she lie to soldiers? Would they search her house? She also worried about Little Fox's family. Were they looking for him? Would they think white people had captured or killed him? The Apache had a reputation for taking revenge against anyone who harmed their children. If they found out she had their boy, would they assume the worst? On the other hand, Elizabeth reasoned, if she could somehow reunite Little Fox with his family, it might actually improve relations between Apache people and white settlers in the area. It could show that not all white people were enemies. When Little Fox emerged from his room wearing Thomas's old shirt and pants, Elizabeth almost cried. The clothes were too big for him, but he looked so much better than he had that afternoon. His face was clean, his hair was combed, and for the first time since she had met him, he was smiling. Elizabeth prepared a simple dinner for both of them. Beans, cornbread, and more of the preserved peaches. They ate together on the porch as the stars came out. Little Fox seemed fascinated by the way Elizabeth ate with a metal fork and knife. He tried to copy her, though he clearly found it easier to eat with his hands. During dinner, Elizabeth tried to learn more about his life. Through gestures and simple words, she discovered that he had 2 older brothers and a younger sister. His father was a warrior, and his mother made beautiful baskets and pottery. They lived in a camp that moved seasonally to follow game and find the best places to gather wild plants. Little Fox, in turn, seemed curious about Elizabeth's life. He pointed to the picture of Thomas that sat on a shelf in her living room and asked questions she couldn't quite understand. She tried to explain that Thomas had been her husband and that he had died, but she wasn't sure if Little Fox understood the concept of marriage as white people practiced it. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth began to see similarities between herself and this Apache child that she hadn't expected. Like her, he was alone and far from the people he loved. Like her, he was trying to survive in a harsh, dangerous world. The main difference was that his separation from family was temporary, while hers was permanent. When it came time for bed, Elizabeth showed little Fox how to blow out the oil lamp in his room, and how to open and close the window if he got too warm during the night. She tried to explain that he was safe here and that she wouldn't let anyone hurt him. Little Fox seemed to understand. For the first time since his ordeal began, he would sleep in a real bed with a full stomach, clean clothes, and a roof over his head. Elizabeth could see the relief and gratitude in his dark eyes. After Little Fox went to bed, Elizabeth sat alone in her kitchen, listening to the night sounds of the desert. She found herself praying more fervently than she had since Thomas died. She prayed for Little Fox's safety and for wisdom to know what to do next. She prayed for his family wherever they were, and she prayed for peace between all the different peoples who called this harsh but beautiful land home. She also couldn't help but feel a deep satisfaction. For the first time in months, her house didn't feel empty. She had someone to cook for, someone to worry about, someone who needed her care. It reminded her of what it felt like to have a family. Elizabeth knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she had done what her heart told her was right. She had shown compassion to a child in need, regardless of the color of his skin or the politics of war. As she finally prepared for bed, Elizabeth heard a soft sound from Little Fox's room. She listened carefully and realized he was crying quietly. She wanted to go comfort him, but she didn't want to embarrass him or make him feel worse. Instead, she sat by her own door and whispered a lullaby that her mother had sung to her when she was little, hoping the gentle sound might help him feel less alone. Eventually, the crying stopped, and Elizabeth could hear the steady breathing that meant Little Fox had fallen asleep. She smiled to herself, feeling more at peace than she had in months. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight a lost child was safe and warm. Elizabeth lay awake for most of that first night, listening to every sound outside her house. Every rustle of wind through the desert plants, every call of a nightbird, every distant howl of a coyote made her heart race. She kept expecting to hear the thunder of horses' hooves, either from Apache warriors coming to look for their missing child, or from cavalry soldiers on patrol. In the room next to hers, Little Fox was finally getting the peaceful sleep his exhausted body desperately needed, but Elizabeth's mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if someone had seen the boy approaching her house? What if neighbors came by unexpectedly? What if Little Fox tried to run away during the night? Around midnight, she heard a soft sound from his room and crept quietly to listen at the door. It sounded like he was talking in his sleep, probably dreaming about his family. Elizabeth's heart ached for him. She could only imagine how confused and frightened he must be, waking up in a strange place among people whose language and customs were completely foreign to him. When morning finally came, Elizabeth was relieved to see sunlight streaming through her windows. She had made it through the first night without disaster. She dressed quickly and went to check on Little Fox, knocking gently on his door before entering. The boy was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking around the room as if he couldn't quite believe where he was. When he saw Elizabeth, his face broke into a shy smile. The good night's sleep had done wonders for him. His eyes were brighter, and he looked much stronger than he had the day before. Elizabeth had prepared a breakfast of eggs from her chickens, pancakes made with precious flour, and milk from her cows. Little Fox watched in fascination as she cooked the eggs in her iron skillet. He had probably never seen eggs prepared this way before. Apache people typically ate eggs raw or roasted them in coals. During breakfast, Elizabeth tried to teach Little Fox some English words while learning more Apache words from him. They pointed to objects around the house and took turns saying the words in their different languages. Water became tu in Apache. Bread became ba. It was slow going, but they were beginning to understand each other a little better. After breakfast, Elizabeth decided to show Little Fox around her small ranch. She wanted him to understand that this was a peaceful place where he would be safe. They started with the chicken coop, where Little Fox was delighted by the hens and their chicks. He had clearly never seen domesticated chickens before, and he laughed when one of the bolder hens pecked at his fingers looking for food. Elizabeth showed him how to gather eggs, and Little Fox caught on quickly. His hands were small and gentle, perfect for reaching into the nests without disturbing the hens too much. Elizabeth could see that he was naturally good with animals, probably from growing up in a culture that depended on hunting and understanding animal behavior. Next, they visited the cows. Little Fox was amazed by how tame they were compared to the wild animals he was used to. Elizabeth showed him how to milk a cow, and although he found it difficult at first, he was eager to learn. She could tell he was the kind of child who liked to be useful and contribute to the work that needed to be done. In the garden, Little Fox proved to be an excellent helper. He quickly learned to tell the difference between vegetables and weeds, and his small fingers were perfect for the delicate work of thinning seedlings. Elizabeth was impressed by how quickly he picked up new tasks and how hard he was willing to work. As they worked together, Elizabeth began to see the world through Little Fox's eyes. Things she took for granted, like metal tools and planted gardens, were wonders to him. He was fascinated by her water pump and spent several minutes working the handle up and down, marveling at how the water flowed out. In return, Little Fox taught Elizabeth things about the desert that she had never known. He showed her which plants could be eaten and which ones should be avoided. He demonstrated how to read animal tracks in the sand and how to predict weather changes by watching the behavior of birds and insects. Elizabeth was amazed by how much this 8-year-old boy knew about survival in the wilderness. She realized that Apache children learned skills that white children never developed. Little Fox could identify edible plants, track animals, and navigate by the stars. His education was different from what white children received, but it was no less valuable. By the afternoon, a comfortable routine had developed between them. They worked together in companionable silence, communicating through gestures and the growing vocabulary of shared words they were building. Elizabeth found herself enjoying Little Fox's company more than she had enjoyed anyone's company since Thomas died. But as the second evening approached, Elizabeth's worries returned. How long could this situation continue? Little Fox's family was surely looking for him. The longer he stayed missing, the more desperate and angry they would become. And the longer he stayed with her, the greater the risk that someone would discover them. That night, Little Fox seemed more relaxed and at ease in the house. He helped Elizabeth prepare dinner, and they ate together on the porch again. Little Fox was becoming more talkative, chattering away in Apache and using gestures to try to explain things to Elizabeth. She couldn't understand most of what he said, but she loved hearing the musical sound of his language. After dinner, Little Fox surprised Elizabeth by producing a small object from his pocket. It was a piece of wood that he had been carving with a sharp stone he had found in the garden. Even though he had only been working on it for a few hours, Elizabeth could see that it was going to be a bird of some kind. The boy was clearly talented at carving. Elizabeth rummaged through Thomas's old tools and found a small sharp knife that would be better for carving than the rough stone Little Fox had been using. When she gave it to him, his face lit up with joy. He immediately went back to work on his carving, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. Watching him work, Elizabeth felt a deep sadness. Little Fox was such a bright, talented, loving child. In a different world, one without war and prejudice, he could have been her own son. She could have taught him to read and write, and he could have taught her about the natural world. They could have been a family. But this wasn't a different world, and Elizabeth knew their time together was borrowed time. Soon, one way or another, Little Fox would have to return to his own people. The thought of losing him already made her heart ache. As they prepared for bed on the second night, Little Fox did something that surprised Elizabeth. He hugged her. It was just a quick, shy embrace, but it spoke volumes about the trust that had developed between them. This Apache child, who had every reason to fear white people, now trusted Elizabeth enough to show her affection. Elizabeth hugged him back, fighting back tears. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered in English, then tried to say the same thing in Apache using the words he had taught her. That night, Elizabeth slept a little better. She was becoming attached to Little Fox, and she could tell he was becoming attached to her. They were forming a bond that transcended race and culture and the politics of war. It was a bond based on simple human kindness and the universal need for family and belonging. But even as Elizabeth allowed herself to enjoy having Little Fox in her life, she knew that their peaceful time together couldn't last forever. Somewhere out in the vast desert, his real family was looking for him, and when they found him, Elizabeth's quiet, solitary life would change forever. The third day dawned bright and clear. and Elizabeth woke to the sound of Little Fox already moving around in his room. When she went to check on him, she found that he had made his bed neatly and folded the clothes she had given him. His natural courtesy and helpfulness impressed her once again. Over breakfast, Little Fox seemed more relaxed and talkative than ever. He was picking up English words quickly, and Elizabeth was learning more Apache phrases each day. Their conversations were still basic, but they could communicate about simple things like food, work, and feelings. "Elizabeth Good," Little Fox said in his careful English, pointing to her and smiling. "Little Fox happy here." The words warmed Elizabeth's heart, but they also worried her. She didn't want him to become too attached to this life if he was going to have to leave soon. At the same time, she couldn't help but feel happy that she was able to give him some comfort during his difficult time. After breakfast, Little Fox insisted on helping with all the morning chores. He had already learned the routine and moved confidently around the ranch, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, and helping to milk the cows. Elizabeth was amazed by how quickly he had adapted to this completely different way of life. While they worked, Little Fox began teaching Elizabeth about his own culture. He showed her how to weave grass into strong rope, using techniques his grandmother had taught him. He demonstrated how to make a simple trap for catching small animals, though Elizabeth made him promise not to actually use it on her property. Most fascinating to Elizabeth were the stories Little Fox told about his people's relationship with the natural world. Everything in nature had a spirit and a purpose according to Apache beliefs. The mountains, the rivers, the animals, and even individual trees all had personalities and powers that humans needed to respect. "Desert alive," Little Fox explained in his growing English vocabulary, gesturing broadly at the landscape around them. "Desert watch us. Desert know we here." Elizabeth found this perspective beautiful and profound. Her own Christian faith had taught her that God created the natural world, but Apache beliefs seemed to see the divine as living within nature itself. It was a different way of understanding the same fundamental truth about the sacredness of creation. In return, Elizabeth shared some of her own knowledge and skills with Little Fox. She taught him to read simple words by writing them in the dirt with a stick. He was a quick learner and seemed fascinated by the idea that marks on paper or in the sand could represent spoken words. "This magic?" Little Fox asked when Elizabeth wrote his name in the dirt. "Not magic," Elizabeth laughed. "Just another way to talk. Like you talk with your hands, we talk with marks." Elizabeth also showed Little Fox some of the books she owned, including a Bible with pictures and a collection of stories that had belonged to her mother. Little Fox spent a long time looking at the illustrations, asking questions about the strange scenes and people depicted in them. When Elizabeth tried to explain that the Bible told stories about God and Jesus, Little Fox listened politely but seemed confused. His people had their own spiritual beliefs that were very different from Christianity. Elizabeth didn't try to convert him or convince him that her beliefs were better than his. Instead, she found herself genuinely curious about Apache spirituality and asked him to tell her more about his people's ways. As the day progressed, Elizabeth noticed that Little Fox seemed to be watching the horizons more carefully than usual. Several times she caught him staring intently toward the mountains where he had said his family had fled. She wondered if he was hoping to see some sign of them or if he was worried about something. "You think about your family?" Elizabeth asked gently. Little Fox nodded, his expression becoming sad. He spoke rapidly in Apache, then tried to translate some of it into English. "Mother cry for Little Fox, father angry. Think soldiers take Little Fox away." Elizabeth's heart broke for him and for his family. She tried to imagine what Little Fox's mother must be going through, not knowing if her child was alive or dead. As a woman who had desperately wanted children, Elizabeth could barely stand to think about such anguish. "We find your family," Elizabeth promised, though she had no idea how she could keep such a promise. "Bring you home safe." Little Fox looked at her with such hope and trust that Elizabeth felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. How could she possibly reunite him with his people? She didn't know where they were or how to contact them safely. And even if she could find them, would they trust her motives? That afternoon, Little Fox taught Elizabeth one of the most valuable lessons she had ever learned. They were working in the garden when a rattlesnake appeared near the bean plants. Elizabeth's first instinct was to grab her hoe and kill it, but Little Fox stopped her. "No kill," he said urgently. Snake not bad. Snake just live. Instead of attacking the snake, Little Fox began speaking to it in Apache in a low, calm voice. Amazingly, the snake seemed to listen. After a few moments, it turned and slithered away into the desert, leaving them alone. "How did you do that?" Elizabeth asked in amazement. Little Fox struggled to explain in his limited English. "All animals, brothers. All animals understand if you speak truth. Snake know we not hurt snake home. Snake go find new place." Elizabeth was deeply moved by this approach to dealing with dangerous situations. Instead of responding with violence, Little Fox had chosen communication and respect. It made her think about the conflicts between white settlers and Apache people. How many problems might be solved if both sides tried talking instead of fighting? As evening approached on the third day, Elizabeth found herself dreading the night. Not because she was afraid of discovery, but because she was afraid that each night might be their last together. She had grown genuinely fond of Little Fox, and she could tell he cared about her too. During dinner, Little Fox surprised her by asking about Thomas. He pointed to the picture on the shelf and said, "Elizabeth man? Where Elizabeth man go?" Elizabeth tried to explain that Thomas had been her husband, and that he had died of sickness. Little Fox listened carefully, then came over and put his small hand on her arm. "Little Fox sorry Elizabeth man go spirit world," he said solemnly. Elizabeth sad like Little Fox sad for family. It was the first time since Thomas's death that anyone had expressed sympathy for her loss in a way that truly comforted her. There was something about Little Fox's simple, direct acknowledgement of her pain that meant more to her than all the well-meaning but awkward condolences she had received from white neighbors. That evening, they sat on the porch longer than usual, watching the stars come out. Little Fox pointed to different constellations and told Elizabeth the Apache stories about them. According to his people, the stars were the campfires of warriors who had died in battle and gone to live in the sky. The Milky Way was the trail that spirits followed to reach the afterlife. "Thomas there?" Little Fox asked, pointing to the star-filled sky. "I hope so," Elizabeth replied. "I like to think he's watching over us." Little Fox nodded seriously. "Apache spirits watch too. Keep Little Fox safe. Keep Elizabeth safe." As they prepared for bed that third night, both Elizabeth and Little Fox seemed reluctant to end the day. They had grown comfortable with each other's company, and the outside world seemed very far away. Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine just for a moment what it would be like if Little Fox could stay with her permanently. They could be a family of sorts, learning from each other and taking care of each other. But even as she indulged in this fantasy, Elizabeth knew it was impossible. Little Fox belonged with his own people, and they belonged to him. Her job was not to keep him, but to help him find his way home, no matter how much it would hurt to let him go. As she tucked Little Fox into bed that night, he looked up at her with serious dark eyes. "Elizabeth, good mother," he said quietly. Little Fox wish things different. Elizabeth kissed his forehead gently. "I wish things were different too, little one. But tomorrow is a new day, and we'll face whatever comes together." Outside, the desert wind was picking up, carrying with it the sense of sage and distant rain. Neither Elizabeth nor Little Fox knew it yet. But tomorrow would indeed bring something different. Tomorrow would bring the sound of horses and the drums of war, and their peaceful time together would come to an end. Elizabeth's eyes snapped open in the gray darkness before dawn. Something had awakened her, but she wasn't sure what. She lay perfectly still, listening to the sounds of the desert night. At first, everything seemed normal. Then she heard it again, a low rumbling sound in the distance like thunder. But the sky was clear. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what she was hearing. Horses, many horses, moving fast across the desert floor. The sound was still far away, but it was getting closer. Elizabeth slipped out of bed as quietly as she could and crept to her window. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see nothing but empty desert stretching toward the mountains. But the sound of hoofbeats was definitely getting louder. She quickly pulled on her clothes and tiptoed to Little Fox's room. The boy was still asleep, curled up peacefully under the blankets she had given him. For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated. Part of her wanted to let him sleep, to give him a few more minutes of peace before whatever was coming reached them. But she knew she had to wake him. If these were cavalry soldiers, she needed time to hide him or think of some explanation for his presence. If they were Apache warriors, Little Fox needed to be awake to identify them and help her communicate. "Little Fox," she whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. "Wake up, there are riders coming." The boy's eyes opened immediately, and Elizabeth could see that he was instantly alert. Growing up in a world where danger could appear at any moment had taught him to wake up ready for action. Little Fox sat up and listened carefully to the sound of approaching horses. His expression changed from sleepy confusion to excitement, and then to something Elizabeth couldn't quite read: hope mixed with fear. "Apache," he said quietly. "Many warriors." Coming fast, Elizabeth's heart began racing even faster. Apache warriors were coming to her house. Were they looking for Little Fox? Had they somehow tracked him here? And what would they do to her when they found their child in the home of a white woman? Little Fox jumped out of bed and ran to the window. In the growing dawn light, they could now see the riders clearly. There were 12 of them, moving across the desert in a tight formation. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see that they were painted for war and carrying weapons. "My father," Little Fox cried out in excitement, pointing to the lead rider. "My uncle, my brothers." Little Fox's joy at seeing his family was obvious, but Elizabeth felt a chill of terror. These were not friendly visitors coming to thank her for taking care of their child. These were Apache warriors who might well assume that she had captured or harmed Little Fox. The war party was now close enough that Elizabeth could see individual faces. The men looked fierce and determined, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding. They had obviously been traveling all night, probably following Little Fox's trail. Elizabeth tried to think quickly. What could she do to show these warriors that she meant no harm? How could she communicate that she had helped their child, not hurt him? "Little Fox," she said urgently, "you must tell your father that I helped you. Tell him I gave you food and a safe place to sleep. Make sure he understands that I am a friend." Little Fox nodded eagerly. "Little Fox, tell father." "Elizabeth, good woman." Elizabeth helped Little Fox. The sound of hoofbeats was now thunderous, and Elizabeth could feel the vibrations through the floor of her house. The war party was approaching at full speed, kicking up a huge cloud of dust. Elizabeth's hands were shaking as she tried to decide what to do. Should she go outside to meet them? Should she stay inside and let Little Fox go out first? Should she have her rifle ready just in case? She decided that showing trust was better than showing fear. If she came out armed, the warriors might see it as a threat. If she stayed inside, they might think she was trying to hide something. Her best chance was to face them openly and hope that Little Fox could explain the situation before anyone made a fatal mistake. "Come," she said to Little Fox. "We go outside together. Stay close to me until you can talk to your father." They walked out onto the porch just as the war party reached the edge of Elizabeth's property. The sight of 12 painted Apache warriors on horseback was both terrifying and magnificent. These men were clearly skilled fighters, and their horses were some of the finest Elizabeth had ever seen. The lead warrior, who Little Fox had identified as his father, raised his hand, and the entire party stopped about 50 yards from the house. The sudden silence after the thunderous approach was almost as frightening as the noise had been. Elizabeth could see the family resemblance between Little Fox and his father. They had the same dark eyes and proud bearing. But where Little Fox's expression was open and trusting, his father's face was hard and unreadable. For a long moment, nobody moved. The Apache warriors sat perfectly still on their horses, studying Elizabeth and the situation. Elizabeth stood frozen on her porch, acutely aware that her life might depend on what happened in the next few minutes. Then Little Fox broke the tension by calling out to his family in Apache. His voice was high and excited as he waved to his father and brothers. The joy in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth could see some of the hardness leave his father's expression. Little Fox ran down from the porch toward his family, calling out what sounded like explanations and greetings. Elizabeth stayed where she was, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might be seen as threatening. The boy's father dismounted and caught Little Fox in a fierce embrace. Elizabeth could see the relief and love in the man's face as he held his son. Whatever else happened, she was glad that this family had been reunited. But she was also terrified about what would happen next. The other warriors remained mounted, their weapons ready. Elizabeth could see some of them looking at her with suspicion and anger. To them, she was probably just another white settler who might have harmed their children or taken their land. Little Fox was talking rapidly to his father, gesturing toward Elizabeth in the house. Elizabeth caught a few words in Apache that she recognized, including the words for food, water, safe, and good woman. The Apache war leader listened to his son's account with careful attention. Elizabeth could see him glancing at her occasionally as Little Fox spoke. His expression was gradually changing from suspicion to what might have been surprise. Elizabeth realized she was holding her breath. Everything depended on whether Little Fox could convince his father that she had helped, rather than harmed him. If the warriors believed she had kidnapped or mistreated their child, nothing would save her. As Little Fox continued his explanation, Elizabeth noticed that some of the other warriors were also beginning to look at her differently. Their hands moved away from their weapons, and their horses seemed to sense the change in tension. Finally, Little Fox finished his story. His father stood up slowly and looked directly at Elizabeth for the first time. His gaze was intense and searching, as if he was trying to read her soul. Elizabeth met his eyes steadily, trying to project honesty and goodwill. She thought about Little Fox's lessons on communicating with animals through truth and respect. Maybe the same principles would work with his father. The Apache war leader began walking slowly toward Elizabeth's porch. She forced herself to remain still, even though every instinct told her to run or reach for her rifle. This was the moment of truth, and there was nothing she could do now except trust in the bond she had formed with Little Fox, and hope that it would be enough to save her life. Elizabeth's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it as Little Fox's father approached her porch. The Apache war leader moved with the fluid grace of a natural fighter, but his steps were deliberate and measured. Behind him, the other warriors remained mounted but alert, their hands resting near their weapons. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Elizabeth could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. Everything about this moment felt balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, and violence could explode across her peaceful ranch. Little Fox stayed close to his father, occasionally speaking in rapid Apache and pointing toward Elizabeth. She caught fragments of words she recognized: hungry, water, sleep, safe. The boy's voice carried urgency and pleading, as if he was trying to convince his father of something very important. When the Apache leader reached the bottom of Elizabeth's porch steps, he stopped and studied her with dark, intelligent eyes. Elizabeth had never felt so thoroughly examined in her life. She sensed that this man was reading everything about her: her posture, her expression, the condition of her clothes and home, even the way she breathed. Elizabeth remembered Little Fox's lessons about speaking truth to animals, and tried to project the same honest openness she had shown to the rattlesnake in her garden. She kept her hands visible and relaxed, her expression calm despite her terror. The war leader spoke a single word in Apache. Elizabeth didn't understand it, but Little Fox immediately responded with a long explanation that seemed to cover everything that had happened over the past 3 days. The boy's voice grew more animated as he described their time together, and Elizabeth heard him use the English words she had taught him mixed in with his native language. As Little Fox spoke, Elizabeth noticed other warriors dismounting and moving closer. These were clearly family members. She could see the resemblance in their faces and the way they looked at Little Fox with relief and affection. An older warrior who might have been Little Fox's grandfather, and 2 younger men who were probably his brothers. The family reunion was touching to watch, but Elizabeth remained focused on Little Fox's father. He was obviously the leader of this group, and his decision would determine her fate. She tried to read his expression as he listened to his son's account, but his face remained carefully neutral. Finally, Little Fox finished his explanation. His father asked him several direct questions, and the boy answered each one earnestly. Elizabeth caught the Apache words for hurt and afraid, and Little Fox shook his head vigorously at each question. He was clearly telling his father that Elizabeth had not harmed him in any way. Then Little Fox did something that surprised everyone. He ran up onto Elizabeth's porch and took her hand, leading her down the steps toward his father. Elizabeth's legs felt weak, but she allowed the boy to guide her. "Father," Little Fox said in careful English, "this Elizabeth. Elizabeth, good woman. Elizabeth, help Little Fox. Elizabeth like Apache mother to Little Fox." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. To be called a mother figure by this brave little boy, and to have him say it in front of his real father, was both an honor and a terrifying responsibility. Little Fox's father studied Elizabeth even more intently after his son's declaration. She could see him taking in the details of her appearance, her simple dress, her calloused hands that showed she worked hard, her face that was weathered by sun and wind but honest. Then the Apache leader did something unexpected. He spoke to Elizabeth directly, using broken English mixed with Spanish words that she partially understood. "My son, he say you give food, give water, give bed for sleep." His English was heavily accented but clear enough to understand. "He say you no hurt. You help." Elizabeth found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Yes, he was hungry and scared. I couldn't just turn away a child who needed help." The war leader nodded slowly. "Why you help Apache, boy? White soldiers hunt Apache. White people fear Apache. Why you no fear?" It was a fair question, and Elizabeth knew her answer was crucial. She thought carefully before speaking. "I judge people by their actions, not by their appearance," she said slowly, hoping he would understand. "Your son showed me respect and kindness. He worked hard and helped me with my chores. He taught me things about the desert and about your people. I saw a good child who needed help, not an enemy." Little Fox translated parts of Elizabeth's answer into Apache for his father. The war leader listened, then asked another question. "You know Apache people enemy of white people? You know soldiers maybe arrest you for help Apache child?" Elizabeth nodded. "I knew it was dangerous, but it was the right thing to do. Your son was lost and hungry. What kind of person would I be if I let a child suffer when I could help?" As she spoke, Elizabeth realized that several of the other warriors had moved closer to listen. They were all watching her with intense curiosity. She wondered how many white people they had ever had a conversation with that didn't involve fighting or running. Little Fox's father was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Then he asked one more question that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. "You have weapon in house? You think maybe you need shoot Apache warriors?" Elizabeth's mouth went dry. She did have her rifle inside, loaded and ready, but somehow admitting that felt like it would destroy the fragile trust that was building between them. "I have a rifle," she said honestly, "but I didn't touch it this morning. I decided that if I was going to die, I would rather die showing trust than showing fear." Little Fox translated this, and Elizabeth saw several of the warriors exchange glances. Their expressions seemed to shift from suspicion toward something that might have been respect. The war leader studied Elizabeth for another long moment. Then he began to speak, partly in English and partly in Apache, with Little Fox translating the parts Elizabeth couldn't understand. "My name is Running Bear," he said. "Little Fox is my youngest son. 3 days ago, soldiers attack our camp. We run to mountains. In confusion, Little Fox become lost. We search everywhere. We think maybe soldiers capture him, or maybe he die in desert." Elizabeth could hear the pain in his voice as he described those 3 terrible days of not knowing what had happened to his child. "We track his trail here," Running Bear continued. "We think maybe white woman take him prisoner. We come ready for fight, ready to take back our boy." He paused and looked directly into Elizabeth's eyes. "But Little Fox tell different story. He say white woman save his life." Elizabeth felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. The relief of not being killed was overwhelming, but there was something more. This Apache father was sharing his pain with her, treating her like a human being worthy of honesty and respect. "I have lost people too," Elizabeth said quietly. "My husband died last winter. I know what it feels like to be alone and afraid. I couldn't let your son feel that way if I could prevent it." Running Bear nodded slowly. Then he did something that changed everything. He placed his right hand over his heart, then extended it toward Elizabeth in a gesture of respect and gratitude. "You give life back to my son," he said solemnly. "You risk your own life to help Apache child. This make you family to my people." Elizabeth watched in amazement as Running Bear removed a silver bracelet from his wrist. The metal was intricately carved with symbols that probably told a story she would never fully understand. "You wear this," he said, placing the bracelet on Elizabeth's arm. "All Apache people see this. They know you are under protection of Running Bear's band. No Apache will harm you. You have friend among the Apache people always." Elizabeth stared at the bracelet, hardly able to believe what was happening. Her simple act of kindness toward a lost child had transformed her from a potential enemy into an adopted member of an Apache family. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the bracelet with trembling fingers. I don't know what to say." Little Fox beamed with pride and happiness. "Now Elizabeth have Apache family too," he said. "Not alone anymore." As the morning sun climbed higher into the desert sky, Elizabeth realized that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer just a lonely widow trying to survive in a harsh land. She was now connected to these proud, strong people in a way she had never imagined possible. But even as joy and relief flooded through her, Elizabeth knew that this was also goodbye. Little Fox would go home with his family where he belonged. The thought of losing him made her heart ache, but she knew it was right. The hardest part of love, she realized, was knowing when to let go. The silver bracelet felt warm against Elizabeth's wrist as she stood surrounded by Apache warriors in the golden morning light. What had begun as her worst nightmare was transforming into something she had never dared to imagine. Acceptance and respect from people she had been taught to fear. Running Bear spoke quietly with his fellow warriors in Apache, and Elizabeth could see their attitudes continuing to change. Where there had been suspicion and readiness for violence, she now saw curiosity and something that looked remarkably like approval. These men were clearly impressed by her care for Little Fox and her courage in facing them without weapons. Little Fox himself was practically glowing with happiness. He stayed close to Elizabeth, occasionally taking her hand or touching the silver bracelet on her arm. It was clear that having his two worlds, his Apache family and his white friend, come together peacefully meant everything to him. "Elizabeth," Running Bear said, drawing her attention back to him, "my son tell me you teach him white man's writing marks. You show him how marks mean words." Elizabeth nodded. "He's very smart. He learned quickly." "You show me these marks?" Running Bear asked. "I want learn white man's magic of talking with marks." Elizabeth was surprised by the request, but she quickly knelt down and smoothed a patch of sandy dirt with her hand. Using a stick, she wrote the word peace in large, clear letters. "This word means peace in English," she explained. "When there is no fighting, no war, no anger between people." Running Bear studied the marks carefully, then took the stick from Elizabeth and tried to copy them. His first attempt was shaky, but he managed to reproduce most of the letters correctly. Little Fox clapped his hands excitedly. "Father learned writing magic too." Several of the other warriors gathered around to watch this exchange. Elizabeth could see that they were fascinated by the concept of written language, even though some of them remained wary of anything associated with white culture. "In Apache, we have no marks for words," Running Bear explained as he practiced writing. "We keep all stories, all history, all knowledge in our minds and pass it down by speaking. This different way." Elizabeth found herself genuinely interested in learning about Apache culture. "That must require incredible memory skills. Your people must be very good at remembering things." "Yes," Running Bear said with pride, "Apache memory strong. We remember every story of our ancestors, every place where water can be found, every trail through mountains. But maybe writing marks also a useful thing to know." As the morning progressed, an remarkable scene unfolded on Elizabeth's small ranch. Apache warriors who had arrived ready for battle were now sitting in the shade of her porch, sharing water from her well and watching their leader learn to write English words in the dirt. Little Fox served as translator and cultural bridge, explaining white customs to his family and Apache ways to Elizabeth. He seemed to take great joy in showing off his new knowledge of both worlds. Elizabeth brought out some of her preserved food to share with her unexpected guests. The warriors were polite but cautious about trying unfamiliar white food. However, when Little Fox enthusiastically ate the preserved peaches and declared them delicious in Apache, several of his relatives decided to try them too. The atmosphere became increasingly relaxed as the morning wore on. Elizabeth found herself in conversation with Little Fox's uncle, a weathered warrior who spoke some Spanish along with his broken English. He told her about the challenges his people faced as more white settlers moved into their traditional territories. "Apache people want only to live free," he explained. "Hunt where our fathers hunted. Gather plants where our mothers gathered. Raise children in old ways. But white people want all land for farms and cattle." Elizabeth listened carefully, beginning to understand the Apache perspective on the conflicts that had torn the territory apart. "Many white people are just trying to survive too," she said gently. "They come here looking for a better life for their families." The uncle nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe both peoples want same thing, good life for children. but we fight instead of talk. This conversation gave Elizabeth an idea that seemed almost impossible, but she decided to voice it anyway. What if there was a way for Apache people and white settlers to help each other instead of fighting? What if we could learn from each other? Running Bear looked up from his writing practice. You think this possible? You think white people want to learn from Apache? Some would, Elizabeth said honestly. Not all, but some. Just like not all Apache want to learn white ways, but some might find them useful. Running Bear considered this for a long moment. You are different kind of white woman, he said finally. You see Little Fox as child who need help, not as enemy. You learn Apache words, Apache ways. You show respect. Elizabeth felt a deep sadness as she realized that their time together was coming to an end. She could see that Running Bear was preparing to leave, and of course Little Fox would go with him. The boy belonged with his family and his own culture, living the life he was born to live. But the thought of saying goodbye to Little Fox was breaking her heart. In just 3 days, he had filled a hole in her life that she hadn't even realized was there. He had brought laughter and purpose back into her empty house. Little Fox seemed to sense her sadness. He came over and took her hand, looking up at her with his serious dark eyes. Elizabeth, sad Little Fox go home? He asked softly. Elizabeth knelt down so she was at his eye level. I'm sad, but I'm also happy, she said honestly. I'm sad because I'll miss you very much. But I'm happy because you're going home to your family where you belong. Little Fox hugged her tightly. Little Fox, never forget Elizabeth. Never forget white woman who saved life. I'll never forget you either, Elizabeth whispered, fighting back tears. Running Bear approached them and placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Time to go, Little Fox, your mother waits for you. Your sister cries for you. Little Fox nodded reluctantly, then ran into the house to get the small wooden bird he had been carving. When he came back out, he pressed it into Elizabeth's hands. For Elizabeth. So remember, Little Fox, he said. Elizabeth looked at the carving through blurred eyes. In just a few days, working with the knife she had given him, Little Fox had created a beautiful little bird that seemed ready to take flight. It was a masterpiece of miniature art. It's beautiful, she said. I'll treasure it always. The warriors began mounting their horses, preparing for the journey back to their hidden camp in the mountains. Running Bear lifted Little Fox onto a spotted pony that had clearly been brought especially for him. Elizabeth, Running Bear said, you remember what I tell you. You wear that bracelet, all Apache people know you are friend, and if you ever need help, if you ever in danger, you make signal fire on that hill. He pointed to a prominent ridge about a mile from her house. Apache warriors see smoke, they come help you. Elizabeth was amazed by this offer. You would really help me? Even though I'm white? You help our child when you could have turned away, Running Bear replied. This make you family. Apache people always help family. As the war party prepared to leave, Elizabeth felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened. In the space of one morning, her understanding of the world had been turned upside down. The Apache people she had been taught to fear had shown her more kindness and respect than many of her white neighbors ever had. Little Fox rode his pony over to where Elizabeth stood. Elizabeth, be happy, he said in his careful English. Little Fox, be happy too. Maybe someday Little Fox come visit again. I would like that very much, Elizabeth said, reaching up to squeeze his small hand one last time. The war party began moving away from the ranch, heading back toward the mountains where their people waited. Elizabeth stood in her yard, watching them go until they disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert. That afternoon, as Elizabeth went about her usual chores, her house felt emptier than it had ever felt before. But it was a different kind of emptiness than she had experienced after Thomas died. This was the emptiness that comes after something wonderful has ended, not the emptiness of something that was never meant to be. Over the months and years that followed, Elizabeth's life changed in ways she never could have predicted. Word of her friendship with Running Bear's band spread among both Apache and white communities. Some white settlers condemned her as a traitor, but others came to her when they needed someone who could communicate with Apache people. Elizabeth became an unofficial peace mediator, helping to prevent conflicts and misunderstandings between the two cultures. Her small ranch became a neutral meeting ground where Apache and white leaders could talk without fear of ambush. True to Running Bear's promise, Apache warriors did watch over her. Several times over the years, they left game for her when hunting was good. or warned her about approaching dangers. The silver bracelet on her wrist became known throughout the territory as a symbol of safe passage. Little Fox did visit her again, first as a growing boy learning the skills of a warrior, and later as a young man preparing to start his own family. Each visit filled Elizabeth's heart with joy and reminded her that sometimes the most important moments in life come from the simplest acts of human kindness. Elizabeth never remarried, but she was never truly alone again. She had found something rarer than romantic love.